Good morning and welcome back to our last session of the Eudora Welty Writers Symposium. As always, we're very grateful to the Robert M. Herron Foundation for their support of the symposium and to Mississippi University for Women. I'm Kendall Dunkelberg, Chair of Languages, Literature, and Philosophy and Director of our low residency MFA program. And our moderator this morning is TK Lee, or Chris Lee, as we like to call him. So let me turn it over to Chris, and he'll introduce our speakers.
Well, thank you very much, Dr. Dunkelberg. It's a privilege to be here and serving as your moderator for the last block of the 32nd Annual Eudora Welty Symposium. And what a seasoned and esteemed panel of guest authors we have the honor of visiting with this morning to close out yet another successful symposium. And so we will get started with hearing first from Claude Wilkinson, a critic, essayist, painter, and poet whose collection, Reading the Earth, won the Naomi Long Magic Poetry Award. He has also been a provost scholar, as well as a John and Renee Grisham visiting Southern writer in residence at the University of Mississippi. Other honors for his poetry include a Walter E. Dakin Fellowship and the Whiting Writers Award. World Without End marks his fourth poetry collection and takes its title from the last words of the Gloria Patri, but the preceding words, as it was in the beginning, is now, and ever shall be, also echo the book's overall theme. The poems are seemingly infinite in their spiritual implications and are woven throughout our experiences in the natural world, organized in this collection into meditations on family and community, spiritual worldviews, art and its insights, and nature's endless source of ever-relevant metaphor. The poems also speak to each other across these sections and even with poems in Wilkinson's earlier collections. His gift for ekphrastic poetry remains strong in World Without End, though here it is more referential and elusive. Rather than engaging specific works of art, he strives to understand the broader aesthetic visions of figures like Theodore Dreiser, Vincent van Gogh, and Walter Anderson. Here is Claude Wilkinson.
Good morning. I'm going to read from World Without End, and it begins with two epigraphs that serve as guides for readers throughout the collection of the four untitled but theme-oriented sections of the book. The first is from the book of Genesis in the Bible, and it reads, "Evening passed and morning came. That was the first day." Genesis 1 and 5. The second epigraph is from Mississippi artist Walter Inglis Anderson, who was also a poet. It reads, "The first poetry is always written against the wind by sailors and farmers who sing with the wind in their teeth. The second poetry is written by scholars and students, wine drinkers who have learned to know a good thing. The third poetry is sometimes never written, but when it is written by those who have brought nature and art together into one thing." Walter Inglis Anderson. From the first section, "Among other things, my father teaches me how to mow grass." Of course, there would be further nuggets, such as keeping my hands at 10 and 2 o'clock around the Polara's big steering wheel, that girls could easily get pregnant. But first, it was his way to steady a lawnmower with a foot on top before snatching the starter rope, as I now imagine Nimrod might have taught his son how to draw a bow. Never mind Mississippi heat. Anytime after the dew had dried and grass was over 2 inches tall. A yard was fit to be cut. And if for any reason it wasn't finished before dusk, I could still go on under light of our rural moon as long as I held to his simple rules. Whether you are a child too close to your world, merely trust the brilliant lizard will skitter to safety. Don't get distracted by a mist of white flies who burst up before you like petals off windblown violets. And though you see them with complete adoration, expect even grounded lightning bugs to fend for themselves. Last, yet above all else, after making that first straight pass, be sure the moore's inside wheels roll in your outside track, so the side discharge blows clippings away from the part you've already cut, which I then tried to take as a kind of blessed assurance that everything in this life, if done just right, should somehow fall in place. Heaven and earth. Some days bluebirds are too much from God, as when one lit in the frill of Queen Anne's lace for a holy moment looked straight to my eyes in the tongues of angels and of men without ever singing a note. His rust-colored breast a parable of terra firma, the wound of our constant condition. So yes, I thought of a friend trembling under Parkinson's, who can no longer even hold his camera steady, he tells me. How he's up to over 20 different pills a day. Once, maybe 2 or 3 years back, we talked about what an art form bagging groceries used to be. How even the greenest teenagers knew to separate canned goods from fruit, all to underscore, in our now middle-aged way of looking at things, the downward spiral our world is on. And yes, I thought of Maeterlinck's play, Allo Soy Blue, its morality of pedestrian happiness, such as having virtue and every night seeing that the stars are still present. Only where is our guide, our Björlund, to say what is or isn't fair? Then, just as suddenly, the little fellow hopped a perfect half pirouette for me to behold the fullness of his glory and every answer there in that satin firmament. Lenten. Like this one, many a Sunday morning, I've wondered if it wouldn't have been better to be a supposed soulless form of life, say with a rabbit's liberty, at least springing toward some obvious purpose of Timothy or clover, greening through our surprise snow in March, even either of 2 robins squabbling for a crabapple perch. That is, till I remember a dooming hawk who thrones on the bustling wires, or sometimes among high sweet gums. How the other evening he fell on a thing so small and hopeless, crossing a dandelion gauntlet. Still, what it is to be always found wanting, not entirely sold on the notion that letting go of anything will draw one nearer to God. At times, only half believing though this close to the cherry orchards and dogwoods blooming, just a month out from the full brightness of Easter. Hardly more than a day later, I'm told that a childhood friend has died in his sleep. We all knew that he drank too much and smoked too much and had for too long, that for quite a while there had been a blot on his lung. But death rarely, if ever, seems a timely endeavor. Andy Warhol, in his diary, describes it as the ultimate embarrassment, being unable to apologize for not returning calls and missing appointments, as well as for the rest of us who have to continue thinking of breakfast, what to put on against a new blast of cold. They say when my friend's sister found him, rigor mortis had begun to set in, that in bed he was lying prostrate, the way we might imagine Moses or Paul having done, before each one's blinding summons of light, as if to signify that this was it, the last and the best of what he had to give, like a figure of the fallen Christ. Remembering my mother cleaning fish. How ordinary they became in her leaching of their numb freshwater smell, the last of their rainbow sheen. Translucent scales flicked like arms at her feet. She would then slit the swell of their bellies clean through to what could be any ruffle of crimson things. Opening a fat bull head once and knowing the Bible the way she did, my mother more than likely thought of Jonah when she found another whole fish inside. In some spots above its gills and next to fins, still as clear as new flame, though lower, already tinged with the rich gold of decay, gone just long enough to learn how infinity feels. Praise. When I return home, a cardinal chides me from his pew of newly green linden leaves. Apparently, I should have gone to church, even on a drizzly morning, instead of just to market for the bread and blueberries and oranges that I needed. For there he sits in the heart of his vexingly obedient worship, singing thanks for his red affluence and sound wings. True, who can accuse him of not always keeping the Sabbath holy? But couldn't my own ritualistic sniffing of mangoes and the thumping of cantaloupes be a similar kind of glory? Prophecy. For the sake of record, it's autumn, Thursday night. Anything else and the point could be lost, if there is any, in what's more likely just another wonder of one's inestimable life. But what seems important, improbable even at harvest, is the astonishing storybook moon, down to the detail of an old man's face, as close as a whisper over burned delta fields, their breath lingering for miles. And then its light begins to disappear behind an illusion of cerulean, under a feathery wand of cloud, as it might in a magician's trick, till nothing is left but unbelief. If only the message had been less ethereal, written on the brightness of a gilded creek, brought as a band of unforgettable horses, stitching the rose horizon, or even in hymns of familiar birds. The first two lines in this poem refer to Audubon, John James Audubon's little known Haitian heritage. In the beginning, Audubon, shed of all that was Haitian, down to the sempiternal mingling concealed in his blood, a different quest for color arose in the earth's kaleidoscope of birds, one so ethereal, which he cherished more than the others, that he couldn't just shoot as he had the flamingos, gerfalcons, and quail, but rather he limed the chalice of flowers with honeyed wine, so that when the tiny blaze hovered in, this one of those he called glittering fragments of rainbows, then drank till it fell from glory, as if through a karmic prism, spinning wings slowed to hues from a whirring spectrum of white. Walter Anderson regrets killing a sea turtle. What must it have been like, dodging loony kisses, bearing all the unintelligible Whitfield sounds, day after day, while you could still understand Besmogard's 7 motifs in art, whirling motion in a pine cone, the occult of hovering gulls, while your heart was out there with the thunder and sunsets of Horn Isle paradise, where you could lie for hours, marveling at white sand swaths of a copperhead, in waiting for dark and the star-like stare around your camp from some raccoon pantoon. Your heart there noting our world's whole stage in the pink eternity of a shell. Though in the cleansing surf of turquoise tide, through waving sea oats of dream, your sin returns again and again and again, lumbering its inconsolable carapace, bashed in thoughtless human moment, so that no iridescence of hummingbirds needling between thistle, nor any cormorant's webbed revelation might erase hapless testudinal eyes, which each night grew more tortured, irreducible, Blakean. And from the last section, weed. What easy gluttonous bumble rolls through the dusty rose deserts of clover, till I rip the cord of my moor for the first time each year. Were it not for neighbors and vanity's sake, I'd simply let them be as beautiful as they are, all the lawn daisies with their halos of white rays circling pastel heads on near impossible to nip supple green stems waving like standards in early April's chilly breeze. And not just them, but the self-heal and creeping buttercups, the star shapes of ragwort, bumper crops of dandelion, slender speedwell, or Veronica filiformis by its fancier handle. The purplish and white sprays of bull thistle and wild carrot, a skulk of foxtail, velvet leaf, lady's thumb, lamb's quarters, dead nettle, such orange wings of hawkweed, the brilliant, brilliant yellow wood sorrel, which must spring up overnight like a fairy tale, or Jonah's beloved gourd, and seems too sacred to kill. This next poem is mimetic of one of my favorite poems entitled Ozymandias by Shelley. And it is an homage to the tone and the subject matter of Ozymandias. The Goliath bird-eating spider. Under an ancient-looking prop, it hides, especially from the young Spanish boy, peering, straining to fathom its great size. Behind the haunted glass, there seems a ploy to suspend our mystery while it bides, covered by moss and web and scraps of wood. A placard of its reputation bids, we image that what would scoff it is its food. The Philistine who cursed God without care, proclaiming it king of all arachnids, that other spiders should gaze and despair. But its terrarium is just as small as ants or roaches exhibited there, showing mostly even the mighty fall. Deer crossing. Early one evening in summer or autumn, probably autumn, along Mississippi 304, I learned the difference between desire and calling. And though I don't recollect enough of the rest of the day to flush out any life-changing epistle, afterward, I couldn't forget that line from a William Stafford poem, resounding, I thought hard for us all. Even without the infamy of any yellow warning with an antlered silhouette launched in space, I simply knew every lane should slow down. When first the doe appeared, bounding toward and over a pasture fence, then another just as light, and the steady buck chasing them both. Surviving every radiant mangling coming from our direction, and then the familiar grasses of the median, the prima deer began to mix metaphors as her point hooves hit the next slippery stage, missed their jetée, and sent her skidding on her flank like a base runner narrowly ducking a tag from drivers who refused to stop. Apostolic in their creed, their fearlessness of uncertainty, they kept the same stride, even after witnessing such a thin escape. Each deer breaking through in turn, knowing nothing but a promise, and that on the other side. Winter field white with snow geese. I thought to entice my students with Baudelaire's indulgences in absinthe and his mulatto mistress, though none of them ever give a sonnet about anything at 8 a.m. in a cold fluorescent room. What an anachronism I must seem, drifting back by rote, still loving the lives of those from centuries ago. Only I, waltzing among dusty museums of synesthesia and empire, as if through a tableau vivant before their drowsing eyes. But nearing yesterday's bland fields, there's suddenly now such a blizzard of honking and descending splendor that I recall a story about sacred geese kept in the temple of Juno, how their startled racket supposedly alerted sleeping Rome before Gauls invaded, thus saving the day, as it were. And for me, my own segue out of the world's apathy, as these many thousand white blessings offer their random seconds of beauty. Thank you for inviting me.
Claude, I wanted to ask, maybe starting with a question on Walter Anderson. And I know you spoke with our class about a long poem on Vincent van Gogh and kind of the relationship between art and madness, or at least for some artists,
Right.
boundary that they're crossing. What's your fascination with Anderson, and kind of what's your relationship to him as a Mississippi artist?
Well, it's similar to my relationship with Van Gogh, trying to understand how he navigated what was actually genius with at least bouts of insanity. And one note on the beginning of that particular poem, Anderson supposedly only spent about a day in Whitfield, but it's a more recognizable asylum than some of the others that he was in. So that's why I use that particular reference. Obviously, I like his work. I like much of it very much. Maybe 3 decades or so ago, I went to a retrospective exhibition of his work, and it had just been with me for a long period of time. And then I started reading some biographies on him and looking at other examples of his work in various texts. And then I've seen a couple of films on his work as well, and on his life. And all of that just melded together into, for me, what was the expression of a poem. But it has to start with my being an admirer of the artist's work, whether it's a visual artist or someone working in any other form.
Thank you.
I recognize that painting and writing are two different disciplines. Have you ever tried to tackle the same subject matter in the two disciplines?
Some people say that my paintings remind them of my poems, but I never consciously make that effort to make a painting out of something that I've made a poem out of. However, it has occurred in that, for instance, there's a painting I did of a nearby church cemetery, and I also wrote a poem called God's Acre in a collection entitled Reading the Earth that was about doing cemetery work for what was called Decoration Day. And when I made the painting of the cemetery, it was immediately after Decoration Day because the cemetery looks so much more lovely at that time when it's been decorated with flowers and cleaned off everything. So when it does occur, it just occurs. I don't make a conscious effort to try to connect the two, but they are likely connected because the same person is doing the work, you know. So, and my aesthetic doesn't change, nor do my attractions change.
Without ever seeming like there's any sort of religious agenda, there's so much religiosity and sort of finding sacred in secular or mundane moments in the work that you shared. I'm curious if that's something that's always been part of your writing, or did you evolve into that, or how do you view the religious overtones in your work?
Well, it's because it's a part of my life. I suppose it's always been a part of my work, because I began life before I began work as an artist, obviously. Although I did begin drawing at 4, but I've heard from different people of different beliefs say it sounds like their belief, when actually I didn't really have that in mind. I remember one time doing a reading and a woman said, "You sound like a universalist." And I, you know, if that's what she got from it, that's what she got from it. However, my work comes from a Christian perspective, but it's not meant to be a sermon so much as it is a way of presenting what I see and how I see it. And then people come to their own conclusions as to whether to embrace it, ignore it, or reject it.
When you spoke to our class, you said you have an image in your mind of how the poem will look.
Mm-hmm.
Does the image come while you're writing, before you're writing, after you've got the words on the page and then they're arranged? Is there a usual order, or is everyone different?
Usually the arrangement of the poem comes to me when the idea for the poem comes to me. In other words, how it should look on the page comes to me at the same time that I get the idea for the poem. Now, after that, I then have to work towards achieving the image if I discern that it's the correct one for that particular poem. There have been a few times when the way a poem should look came to me, and I later decided that that wasn't the right format for the poem. But generally, when I get an idea for a poem, the way the poem should look on the page, which is quite important to me, is simultaneous with the idea. And by working toward it, I mean that sometimes I have to delete words that I really like and would want to keep in the poem because they don't fit that format. And then I have to make a decision. Is it more important to have this particular word and this line be longer than I expected it to be? Or is it more important for the aesthetic of the poem to look as I imagined it? And so I'm always making those kinds of decisions as well. But as I said, when I spoke to your class, I don't write line by line. So for me now, it's easier to adjust the poem to how I perceive it should look. I only write line by line when I'm writing a traditional form, in a traditional form, such as a sonnet or villanelle or some such form as that. But and they're going to look the way they look, you know, regardless of, you know. So, but otherwise, I make all the line breaks and the stanza organizations after the poem is basically finished, whereas it just looks like prose on the page. As I said, I write from margin to margin, sometimes past the margins and all around the margins. But after that, then I begin the structuring of how I feel it should look on the page.
Is there a particular form that you enjoy most writing in, or one that you find most challenging?
Well, as I mentioned to Kendall's class, I began writing primarily in formal structures. There was a period that I thought I wanted to be a beat poet. And so I tried that for a while, but I saw, thankfully, immediately that that wasn't going to work for me. However, I also mentioned that a number of most of the sonnets that I write are Petrarchan sonnets. You spoke of, you used the term most challenging. The reason I favor Petrarchan sonnets is because that's what I started writing mostly after, while I was in graduate school. One of my professors suggested that the Petrarchan form was the most difficult form. And I saw that as a challenge. And so I just started writing Petrarchan sonnets mainly. In World Without End, there is a Shakespearean sonnet, theories on how Venus de Milo lost her arms. But there's, in the sonnet that I read, that was homage to Shelley's Ozymandias, is in the form of Shelley's Ozymandias. So, but as to one that I find perhaps more enjoyable, the most enjoyable poem that I've ever written is a poem entitled Summer Nights. It's in a collection entitled Marvelous Light. And as I told the class, it's based on, it's inspired and based on black and white photographs of night scenes in Colorado by a favorite photographer of mine named Robert Adams. And it was just something about the writing of that poem. It's a long prose poem, and there there are I believe 38 photographs or so in the collection, and each section of the prose poem addresses the photographs, but it's not ekphrastic in the typical sense of thinking of ekphrastic writing, because it's not really a description of the photographs, it's a story that I make up for the photographs. Because in the beginning of the book, there's a picture of a woman sitting inside what looks to be a 1980s room in a house. The photographs were made in the 80s. And I just imagined her traversing all the scenes throughout the book of photographs. So she's essentially a character that we travel with throughout all the other scenes. And that was just a fascinating process for me. And like I said, that's the most enjoyable poem that I've ever written. And I don't normally write in the prose poem format. I remember I had a graduate student who asked me about prose poems and when did I write them, and I told him when nothing else works. You know, if I've exhausted every other kind of form and it doesn't work, that's when I go to prose poems. But otherwise, you know, I rarely write them. But that was perhaps it was so enjoyable because I love those photographs so much. I love night, and I love rural scenes, and the fact that I was just able to just create a character and make up a story for her was also enjoyable.
Chris, you're on mute. You're on mute. If you can unmute yourself, I can't do that on this end.
Have I been muted this whole time? I know I was talking to someone a minute ago. I'm so sorry. Well, let me tell you what I was saying with my voice and my words. Next up, we have Kate. I can be heard now, correct? I mean, okay, thank you. I feel for my students so much right now. It can happen to anyone. Katy Simpson Smith from Jackson, Mississippi, received a PhD in history from UNC Chapel Hill and an MFA from the Bennington Writing Seminars. She is the author of We Have Raised All of You, Motherhood in the South, 1750 to 1835, and the novels The Story of Land and Sea, Free Men, and most recently, The Everlasting. Her writing has appeared in the New York Times Book Review, Paris Review, Los Angeles Review of Books, Oxford American, Granta, and Literary Hub. She lives in New Orleans and recently served as the Eudora Welty Chair in Southern Literature at Millsaps College. Spanning 2,000 years, The Everlasting follows 4 characters whose struggles resonate across the centuries: an early Christian child martyr, a medieval monk on crypt duty in a church, a Medici princess of Moorish descent, and a contemporary field biologist engaged in an illicit affair. Outsiders to Rome, a city layered and dense with history, this quartet, separated by time, grapple with similar issues: the physicality of bodies, the necessity for sacrifice, and the power of love to sustain and challenge faith. Their small rebellions are witnessed and provoked by an omniscient, time-traveling Satan who, though incorporeal, nonetheless suffers from a heart in search of repair. As each of these conflicted people struggles with forces they cannot control, their circumstances raise profound and timeless questions at the heart of faith, defining what it means to be good, what our duty is to each other, and what God will forgive. So, Ms. Smith.
Thank you so much for that wonderful introduction, Chris. I had the good fortune of participating in the Welty Symposium several years ago and was struck by how warm an environment it was. I made lifelong friends there. And so I was doubly disappointed when the symposium moved to this online format. And I thought, how on earth can they recreate that sense of community? But I have to say, over the past 2 days, this has been the most familial kind of Zoom I've ever participated in. So thank you all so much. I think it's a testament to the hard work of Kendall and MUW, but also the passion and enthusiasm and generosity of the readers and writers and students who have all taken the time to gather here. So thank you all for welcoming me. I've been thinking about the theme of this symposium, which is walking along in the changing times. And it made me think about the body, the way we move through space, the way we're continuing to move kind of in spite of ourselves. But also how it's become this new site of uncertainty. We're washing our hands constantly. We're afraid to touch our faces. It's become this place of vulnerability that feels very new to us. But in fact, that bodily vulnerability is not new at all. And so I want to talk about, I want to read 4 short sections of the novel that in which each of the 4 protagonists confronts their own body. And hopefully it's comforting to know that these vessels that we walk around in have always been subject to wounds of various sorts. So the novel I wrote is called The Everlasting. It came out March 24th, i.e. 4 days after my city of New Orleans went into lockdown. So it's been an interesting journey for sure this year. And it's set in Rome, even though I consider myself a Southern writer and deal with Southern settings and Southern themes. This one just took place in Italy, and I can't really explain it. But I hope that readers find some piece of the global South in this book. So Chris did a great job of setting up the characters for me, so I don't have to really explain to you who they are. I'm going to start with the 21st century. This is the year 2015. And we are meeting Tom, who is a field biologist, American, doing research abroad in Rome, and is having some concerning symptoms for the first time in his body that are alarming him. The tingling in his hands and the periods of dizziness, of headaches that felt like a novice was taking core samples from one ear to the other hadn't subsided. One night he stumbled on his way home from the grocery. A carton of tomato sauce flew into a bush and 2 persimmons rolled rosily away. After a pause, the children across the street continued their game of tag, and Tom stood up to look for the gap in the sidewalk, or the rock, or the invisible tripwire of fishing line. His leg sent a humble message to his brain. It was me. I just went. He collected the groceries he could see in the failing light and limped homeward, feeling betrayed. He spent the next few hours researching his symptoms, including the ones that were obviously unrelated: a raw tongue after consuming pineapple, double-jointed thumbs, and concluded that he had an inoperable brain tumor, or he had the rare but treatable Japanese moya-moya disease, or he was suffering from medium levels of stress, like all healthy Americans. He knew that the mountains of North Carolina, where they'd taken Daphne for spring break, harbored Ixodes scapularis, the small-headed brown vector for Lyme. In his wife's family, ticks were known as devil's buttons. After a night spent half asleep, his subconscious caught in the traitorous networks of his arteries and nerve endings and columnar bone cells. He woke to an out-of-focus dawn, a breakfast a fette biscottate with apricot jam, and a 9 a.m. phone call to the Aventino Medical Group, recommended for their multilingual staff. Tourists are always imagining themselves mid-demise. They could squeeze him in at 4. He took a slow path through Rome's misshapen center, looping past the low bowl where ancient columns shivered in the heavy traffic, snaking along the chain of people waiting to put their hands in the mouth of Verita, climbing out of the miasma of exhaust and myrrh into fresher air, mounting the hill of the Aventine. He entered through 5 tall arches, and a woman named Maria Teresa smiled at him in a holy way and handed him a set of forms. Dr. Tromba was his mother's age, sharp of face, with a swoop of steely hair and a neat white jacket. She directed him to the vinyl examining slab, and he sat like a schoolboy, hands in his lap. Her English had a slight French inflection, and he imagined young Tromba misbehaving in a Swiss boarding school. Her brow didn't furrow at his symptoms. She mentioned the tests she'd like to run, asked a few questions. No, he hadn't been urinating more than normal. No, he didn't have trouble swallowing. No, he didn't consider himself depressed, certainly not more than the average person. What did that mean? Oh, run-of-the-mill emotional complexity. He could at times feel worthless because, let's be frank, what can our worth be in a universe where our lives are brief polluting flashes in the cosmic pan? No, he wasn't attempting humor. He was attempting humility. He was a scientist. Ah, she saw now. She asked him to stand, to walk, to touch various parts of his face. She looked in his ears, shined a light in his eyes, rapped his knees with a mallet. She pushed him gently to see how easy he was to knock over. She wrote up a menu, basic blood work, and an MRI, with the option for others down the road, depending on what they found. He imagined the technicians as 16th century explorers in lead vests, tunneling into the jungles of his nervous system. At this point, we're just ruling things out, she said. I've looked some of this up online, he said, of course. Her placid face did not indicate her disapproval. Exhaustion, that's the easy one, he said. Lyme is trickier, but manageable, right? What's the worst, is what I'm wondering. What am I crossing my fingers against? He despised the tone in his voice, the neediness. The very worst, she said, is that you will die without explanation as soon as you stand up from that chair. This second section is from the 16th century, from the year 1559, and features the protagonist Julia, who is based on a real historical figure, Julia de Medici, who had African ancestry. Her grandmother was an enslaved person from North Africa. And she is attempting to move through Rome with the kind of power that befits a Medici woman, but is facing all kinds of pushback from people who don't believe that women, and especially women with darker skin color, have any kind of voice at all. And she is attempting to purchase some papal lands in the countryside, and has various dealings with priests who do not want to sell her anything, again, because she is a woman. So here she finds one of those priests at a party. Father Lorenzo was a red minnow among the guests, several score of the finest gowns and waistcoats in the city, necklaces strung across high white bosoms, sleeves brocaded with dancing deer, and the handful of priests with their eyes diplomatically downcast. The palace staff had found additional tables to push together, and a pristine cloth, longer than any single cloth she'd seen, collected them all around the illusion of a single piece of furniture. You look like a painted angel, the priest said to her. She didn't have to hunt him down after all. She felt like a master physician whose patient was beginning to show signs of the cure. Julia raised her hands slightly as she turned to better expose her waist to admiration. Aren't you Christians always saying the body is the true temple? My lady, we rarely say that. Have you had any messages from your abbot? We apologize for our assumptions. I'm accustomed. Does the offer suit him? The cardinal smudged his finger around his chin as if feeling for tiny beard hairs. There are legal questions, he said. I can't hear you over the music. A quartet had set up in the corner of the foyer, and the violinist with the pocked face was fiddling away like there were ants on his strings. Did you say you'd like to ask my husband if my Medici money is real? It's contract law, he said, even more quietly. Pardon? Do you want to ask my husband if I'm a witch? Shall I go get him? He's just chatting with the Count of L'Aquila, probably committing troops for the protection of the Holy See. Let me tell him the teenage cardinal wants a word. You'll forgive us, my lady, for our caution. She put a hand on his sloping red shoulder. Below that robe was real skin, skin that was born on a baby with a penis, and that stretched to cover him as he grew into a man and stayed pale and freckled under every shirt and frock, moles sprinkled like the islands of the Indies, each with a dark hair, smoke rising from the volcano. Would that shoulder ever be caressed with anything but pity? He twitched beneath her touch. When she let him go, she dragged her fingers lightly down his arm. Bring the contracts tomorrow, she said, and I'll look them over. I have no intention of breaking any laws. I respect the church's opinion of women. I would be happy, he said, and coughed. I would be happy to stay. I mean, to sit with you. If you're looking for, I would be at your service. I know how a foreigner can find herself in a city like Rome. How? Oh, he said. He waved a hand around as if attempting to whip up the quartet into a high-spirited march. Lonely. She noticed his eyelashes for the first time, how uncannily long they were around his weak eyes. In one blink, she imagined the entire gathered company freed of their clothes. Silks and diamonds vanished. Nothing left but sagging bellies and wobbly thighs and the triangular breasts of men. Hair in places no painter painted. Hair on backs, beneath arms, between legs. The tufts on the tops of big toes. Her own stomach, suspiciously swollen. What of this could people possibly want to see? She shut down the fancy because it required her to wonder if there were parts of her so dark any pretense of whiteness would be lost. No, she said, I don't get lonely. The body wasn't a temple, it was a tool. Now we move to the 9th century, which is not a period of time many of us know much about, including myself, so I had to do much research. The character here is Felix, who is a monk, and his job is to tend the crypt. And in this particular monastery, the crypt takes the form of a putridarium, which is a place where they would store the bodies of dead monks, not in coffins, but seated on stone benches around a room. And the job of the monk was to contemplate their decomposing forms and report back to the other brothers about what shape mortality took, what kinds of messages from God he witnessed in the decay of his brothers' bodies. A monk's funeral was a lonely affair. God was present, of course, and the brothers themselves, somber in brown wool. The body was laid out in a pine coffin, and the family was informed and invited, though no one came. A cluster of men would sing a hymn, and Father Peter would give the mass, followed by a sentence tailored to the actual dead body rather than the theoretical ascending soul. On this wet Sunday, with an anonymous widow snuffling in the back, the father said, "Heaven watch for Benedictus, who walked slow, but ate heartily, and never once admired himself." Sixtus turned to Felix with a look of some doubt. "I believe he means," Felix whispered, "that he didn't comb his hair." "Ah," Sixtus said, satisfied, "though once after a Christmas bath, I saw him crimping his toes playfully, as if he thought them more nimble than the average man's." "You think he had foot pride?" "I wouldn't speak against a dead man." The widow began to wail. "Let's take him out already," Sixtus said, "before he begins to stink up the box." The monastery only had one coffin, a display coffin, as it were, because of course the men weren't buried. But the abbot believed these open masses helped convince the public that the monks were ordinary men, not witches or mystics, and that their bodies would dust to dust, just like theirs. 6 men lifted the coffin on their shoulders and carried it through the side door to the cloisters while the women subsided into sniffs. Once it was dark and the parishioners were safely home with their roast lambs and impure thoughts, the same monks would come back to the open courtyard and pry Benedictus out of his box, sneaking him diagonally down the stairs like a battering ram and propping him up on the next available seat. But first, Felix had to dispose of Brother Timothy. "It's time for your great transition," he said in what he hoped was a soothing tone. These were the climaxes in a job that revolved around tiny changes. He should be given at least a day to really contemplate what it meant to hurl Timothy's bones into an old tub and set up in his stead a new man with all his muscle and meat and nails and lashes. He was afraid he wouldn't pay attention to the right thing, that the following morning he'd kick himself for not running a finger along the spongy circles of Timothy's eye sockets, or pressing his ear to his sternum to listen for a residual heart. He regretted not attending more to Timothy.
I want to go listen to the rest of this.
He regretted not attending more to Timothy, who had died before Felix's tenure, was an inherited corpse, and didn't have the personality of the others. Or was mortality not about memory at all, but about the quick whoosh of a life as it passes from the known to the divine? And if so, what business did Felix have to contemplate their bodies, he who had lived such a paltry life, who was so close to the grave himself? Shouldn't they be tossed toot sweet into a dark hole as a reminder that the body is no firmer than a flame and less pleasantly scented once snuffed? Was he breaking God's law to cradle Timothy's bones so sweetly in his arms? Was he committing the sin of lingering? The room with the sarcophagi was dark. Felix rubbed his forearms along the tops until he found the open one and clattered Timothy in as gently as possible. "I did not know you, but I loved you," he said. "May the Lord embrace and shield you as he did on the day of your birth. May your time in my attendance not have any bearing on your worthiness to sit by the angels." He put a hand down to pat the pile one last time and felt the smallest jolt, as if a breath had flickered from the bones to his living thumb, a sacred touch sent from God to his servant, like a mother spelling, "This is what it means," with her finger on the back of her sleepy child. But then the cockroach scrabbled over the side and hit the floor with a dry rustle. This last section is from the 2nd century of the year 165 CE. And our protagonist here is Prisca, who is 12 years old, very outspoken, and has just heard about the new sort of cult of Christianity from a visiting priest who has come to her farm and told her that there's this man named Jesus Christ who listened to the poor and the weak and the inconsequential. And that message resonates a lot with her. But she is also very skeptical of any man telling her what to do. And of course, she is also, as a 12-year-old, going through puberty. Prisca woke one day to achy feet. She tried to remember where she had walked the day before, whether she'd run without sandals in the back fields or climbed one of the steep hills to the city market or the temple. She checked her soles for spider bites. Anna rubbed them for her, but the next morning they ached still, and a week went by with this low coming and going of pain. Her mother said she was growing and looked at the pantry at the dwindling pots of pickled beans. Prisca still misjudged where the door frames were and shuddered into corners by turning too soon. She cut herself with a knife while chopping an artichoke because her fingers no longer held a familiar relationship with the rest of her hand. It wasn't possible to point to a part of herself and say with confidence, "This is Prisca." The sore feet she wasn't prepared for. The breasts she was. A girl she sometimes went to lessons with got hers the year before. They came bubbling out of her chest like spring fungus, and the boys could look at nothing else. This intrusion seemed like an intentional way to push girls further off balance. Surely it would be harder to stand straight with those things. Hers came in small, and she assiduously crossed her arms against her chest morning and afternoon to prevent them from ballooning anymore. She lay on her stomach at night to tamp them down, though the pressure on them hurt. It was possible they were sentient, little chicks she was suffocating, and she sometimes felt like a bad mother to her body. But mostly her body felt like a bad friend to her. Her brother Servius, aware of the arm crossing, would give her a quick punch in the chest when their mother's back was turned. Fine, she would grind mustard powder into his wine. And after the achy feet and the stretching limbs and the tiny mushroom breasts and the rounding hips and the dark hairs replacing all the light hairs, straw where there was silk, one morning she crawled out of bed and left behind a little rose where her bottom had been. She knew. There was no way not to know on this farm with these half-dozen women with prayers made daily to the spirits of fertility, Ceres, Isis, Bonadea. But nonetheless, she felt a shock, as would any witness at the scene of a death. It occurred to her that the blood she issued was a phenomenon that Jesus, and probably even God, had never experienced. The Lord created all things, the bearded man said, including the cycles, and so has knowledge of all things. But it hasn't come out of him, she said, in the sense that all things emerge from the Lord. But he's a man. He is all things. You call him a he. Does he have a pipina? She waggled her finger near her crotch. The bearded man was looking less patient. He has no form. But Jesus did, a pipina. He set down the linens he'd been folding. Anatomy is not particularly relevant. It's relevant to me, she said, unconvinced that God's knowledge of the menses was equal to her own. She left the priest to his snapping and folding and took a candle up to her dark room, where she stood by the window so the moon could watch her untie the linen bandage around her central fork. The pattern of blood resembled a grand dark continent with strands of islands sprinkling outward. Red people lived on these islands, and they said rich red things. They took red rowboats to the continent and trekked to the high volcano at the center, which was brown as earth. It still had a sheen to it. She pressed her finger on the heart of this, and held up under the whitish flame, it would be impossible to tell whether the blood on her hand was her own, or a goat's, or God's. She tasted it. Her holiness moved in cycles through her, from the bottom of her to her mouth, down through her innards, back to the bottom of her. And like the wine they drank at Eucharist, there was no telling when it might be ordinary and when it might be divine. Thank you.
I have unmuted myself. Do we have any questions or comments for Ms. Smith? We have a few minutes before we move to our last author.
I would like to start. Love your work, Katy. It's so thoughtful. I imagine that you spend a lot of time on developing your characters. So could you talk about that a little bit, how you do that?
Yeah, that's a great question, Joanne. So the characters for this novel at least kind of emerged out of the setting. So when I started writing, I knew what historical eras I wanted to place them in, what the sort of big questions would have been during those years, in terms both of history and of religion. And then I thought, who is the best person positioned to answer these questions or to have conflicts about these questions? So when I knew I wanted to talk about the early years of Christianity, about its uncertainty, I thought about someone whose voice would otherwise be so small, who would be unlistened to. I wanted her to have the leading role in this part of the story. So then I thought, okay, I have this little girl who I'm gonna trace through the moment of her discovering Christianity to the point where she becomes a martyr. So that suspicion transitions into this sort of rabid faith. And then it became a matter of figuring out who she was and how I could convince the reader to take that journey with her, because it's a difficult journey to ask a reader to fall in love with a character that is going to have a very tragic ending. But that's the fun part. It's making her outspoken. It's making her funny. It's making her relatable. It's making her, fall in love with her brother's best friend, and, tragically see him out with another girl and get completely brokenhearted. So I love the sort of challenge of starting with these totemic time periods and then figuring out a way to make very human, granular people to live within them.
Katy, we have a question coming from Facebook. So when I say I, it's not me. This is Emily Liner, I believe, from Friendly City Books, a new bookstore in Columbus. She says, hello from a fellow UNC alum. And I wanted to ask about the structure of the book. Did you always know you wanted to tell the story in that order in 2 parts, or did you experiment with different permutations?
Great question. Hi, Emily, and congrats on the new bookstore. I'm excited to come visit when things get back to normal. The structure was definitely a challenge. I knew that I wanted this grand sweep, that I wanted these 4 characters. I wrote each of the characters pretty much in chronological order. So I wrote all of Prisca's section, then all of Felix and all of Julia, etc. But I knew that wouldn't work for the structure of a novel. A, because you can't just sort of abandon an important character and never return to them. And B, because I didn't want this forward march through time. So I played around a lot with cutting the stories in half and interspersing them together, with cutting the stories into 10 parts and interspersing them. I played with moving forward in time, with moving backward in time, with moving in kind of more obscure ways through time. But when I figured out that, I think what helped me get to the place I am now with the structure is this sense that I wanted to bring readers in a kind of unsuspecting way. I wanted to start with the 21st century. I wanted readers to feel like they were getting in the shallow end of an experience that they might be able to relate to and understand, and then kind of dragging them deeper into the undertow of history, and then allowing them in the second half of the book to resurface again in the shallows, now with all the information they have about these characters and settings in the past, and find new resonances along the way, because there are various overlapping objects and settings and characters. So that's how I came to the structure that I did. I still am not sure if it's the most effective, because I think I could have gone down a dozen different paths.
Katy, I wonder if you'd talk a little bit about your process. The novel is obviously so well researched. How do you keep yourself as a fiction writer from going down a research rabbit hole and never emerging with a manuscript?
It's a great question, Randy. It's really hard. I think the reason I write historical fiction is that I love history. I love the research aspect of it. Going down rabbit holes is really enjoyable. And so, yes, you're right. There's a certain amount of discipline that has to take place. And the way I approach that is I force myself to write simultaneously to researching. So rather than getting paralyzed by the fact that I didn't know anything about Roman history and taking 5 years to educate myself, I started with the few things I did know about Rome, which is it's this fascinating layered place that is so rich with aesthetic, sort of physical beauty. I started with these characters that fascinated me. And then as I started writing them and running into these roadblocks of my own ignorance, I would take breaks to research. So I'd be writing about, Priska running into her mother's house and asking for a snack because she's hungry because she's 12. And then what does a snack look like in the year 165? So I'm going to pause. I'm going to move to the book or the internet and figure out what food habits were at that period in Rome. So for me, having them work side by side with each other was a way to avoid that sort of going down the rabbit hole scariness, and also keep the novel moving forward constantly, keeping the characters and the story at the forefront constantly, rather than writing 5 pages about this random trivia that is just there to show off that I read a book or two. I think that's the hard part, is making sure that in historical fiction, it's the fiction that's primary rather than the historical.
Katy, this is Nora Miller, and I take Tom Richardson's Welty Symposium class, and we really enjoyed reading your book. And I noticed when you were doing the readings, you skipped over Satan's voice. Was Satan always a part of this as you were writing each section, or did you come in afterwards and give his snarky remarks?
Yes, great question, Nora. And thank you for taking the time out of what must be an incredibly busy schedule as the president to come to these events. So thank you. The devil was always part of it. As the characters, as I started writing the characters, and whenever they asked a rhetorical question, I found myself as an author wanting to respond to them, wanting to give them some kind of like nugget of hope to keep them moving on. But I didn't want me as an author to be present in the book. And so the figure I eventually arrived at was Satan. God is a more natural comforter in our imaginations of humanity. But when I thought about the kinds of responses he would give to these struggling humans, they were all so dull, like chin up, everything's gonna be okay. And that's not actually comforting to a human in crisis. So the devil is someone that I imagined, especially after I read Milton's Paradise Lost, in which he is so three-dimensional and complex, that he sympathizes with him. He too has suffered a broken heart. He too has lost so much in his life. I couldn't think of anyone better to sort of usher them through this narrative with a holistic sense of what was going to happen to them. He is the all-seeing, all-knowing one, with just a better sense of humor and just more fun to be around. In terms of reading, I once tried to do a reading where I did read the devil's asides, and I put on little devil horns to indicate when I was reading his voice. But then like my hair got all messed up, and so I just figured it was easier to cut him out. But it encourages people to go read the book to figure out what Satan would say.
Katy, I see another question in Facebook from Shannon Barber. She says, I love that you're using a water metaphor to say how you immerse the reader into the book, because water feels so important throughout. Can you talk about water and how you decided to utilize it?
Oh boy, it's a very smart question. Hi, Shannon. Thank you for asking. I think water has a lot of parallels with history, or with my understanding of history. There's a fluidity to it that I think is really important in disrupting our idea of it as a concrete series of events that happened and are now over. They keep bubbling up again and again, especially this year as we've seen how the influences of history keep recurring and keep informing our current political debates. It's not this hard sedimentary layer at all. But I think water is also sort of a beautiful image when we're talking about religion and faith. It appears, over and over again in the Bible as this, a fount of hope, a sense of a way to ground humanity in cosmic reassurance. And so in the book, there's a lot of There's a lot of rivers, there's springs, there's the 21st century character Tom studies these tiny creatures called ostracods, which are microscopic cousins to shrimp. And they exist in every body of water on all 7 continents. So if you go outside and there's a puddle in your yard, there are probably ostracods in it. So I think water has this feeling of universality. We can all touch it. We all need it. It's part of a necessity for life. So yeah, I would have to sort of reread the book to figure out what I actually do with water in the narrative. But I think absolutely it informs the way I think about faith.
Okay, well, thank you very much for that wonderful read, and we will move on now to, you can hear me, right? Okay, we'll move on to our last guest author to close out the Welty Symposium, Beth Kander. 50 years after the singularity, the world is divided into 2 populations locked in a Cold War. Synthetic citizens, or SINs, human-computer hybrids with extraordinary enhancements and potentially infinite lifespans, and originals, the individuals who did not merge their bodies with the machines. However, the decades-long battle between them is nearing an end because the originals are on the verge of extinction. One of the only young originals left in the world, Air, knows he might someday be the very last of his kind. But when he meets a beautiful, powerful Sin girl called Ever, he questions everything he's been told about this lifelong enemy. Original Sin is a rich, dangerous world of family secrets, free will, forbidden love, and all of the unexpected peril that arises when aggressive technology meets stubborn humanity. Beth Kander, a Mississippi transplant to Chicago, saw her dystopian trilogy, Original Sin, debut in September of 2018. In addition to writing fiction, Beth is also an acclaimed playwright. Selected awards include a core residency with American Theater Company, Equity Library Theater Selection, Ashland New Plays Festival winner 2016 and 2015, and the Kilroy's List honorable mentions in 2015 and 2016. While living in Mississippi, Kander was named Best Writer by the Jackson Free Press 3 times and holds degrees from Brandeis University, the University of Michigan, and Mississippi University for Women. But, and possibly the most interesting fact, is that a few years back, Beth's dog was accidentally in a viral video, which landed him appearances on Web Soup, Attack of the Show, and even in Jay Leno's monologue, causing her to set a new professional goal for herself other than landing on the New York Times bestseller list and making the world a better place, which is to be at least marginally more famous than her dog. Ms. Kander.
Thanks, Chris. I need to update that bio since the Jay Leno reference alone tells you that it was a while ago that Doe was in that monologue. Thank you so much to Kendall for inviting me to be here, and to the entire MUW community for offering this incredible literary event every year. I wish that we were all together on campus for what I know would be such giddy literary socializing, especially right now when we're so hungry for it. I really wish that this were in person, but I have been so moved and inspired by these readings shared across the distance, and I'm honored to be in this lineup of incredible writers. My reading today feels maybe overly fitting with these symposiums walking through changing times themes. The original Sin trilogy is something I wrote a decade ago, although the final book in the series just came out this month. Especially for all the students, publishing is a slog. Spoiler alert, keep going. I wrote it while I was still in my 20s, while I was still living in Mississippi, before I had a literary agent, before I had kids, before I had an MFA cohort to critique it, before I even knew what sort of stories I wanted to tell, but did already know in my bones I wanted to tell stories. It's a dystopian epic I wrote before life imitated art, and dystopia became a word that we now make reference to before slipping on our masks and heading out to pick up curbside groceries. I also wrote this particular story in a very white male dominated genre, author and character wise, and initially even I found that I was writing a lot of male characters. And you'll see a trajectory over the course of the trilogy where that becomes a lot less true. And that has certainly been maintained in everything I have written after it. So the truth is, I have been changing as a writer. I write differently now and read my own work differently now than I did a decade ago. And the section I'm going to read today is one I've actually not done a public reading of. And it centers a character who's a supporting character, but who I think really resonates right now, particularly for me. She is a mother, a fighter, an activist trying to overthrow a system that privileges a few with power and abandoned everyone else. Also, her name is Ruth. So I would like to dedicate the reading of this section to Ruth Bader Ginsburg, a hero of mine. May her memory be a blessing. If time allows, we'll see in the spirit of Halloween, I might also read just a little bit from my ghost story, which is more indicative of the stories I'm trying to tell now, a lot closer to the bone. As a woman, feminist, second-generation American, newish Jewish mother, very haunted human, and so on. But let's start with Ruth and Original Sin. Ruth woke up early, before her sister was up, before the sun was up. She crawled out of their bedroom window using the old fire escape Sophie insisted Howard install years ago. She shimmied all the way up to the roof of the house, sat down cross-legged, and lit a cigarette. She felt a dark, punishing pleasure at the burning in her throat, the tightening of her lungs. She knew she was poisoning herself, shortening her life expectancy. But if she lived long enough to die of lung cancer, well, that would be a nice damn surprise. She was expecting an earlier and far more violent death. If Rachel knew what I did last night. Ruth pushed the thought away immediately, almost afraid her sleeping twin might somehow read her mind. Delicate, determined Rachel, if anyone could hone telepathy, it would be her. And these days, Ruth couldn't afford to have her sister tiptoe around her brain. The twins were the last children still living with Howard and Sophie. Dina, Micah, Ellie, Tamar, Isaac, Mo, everyone was in college or working. Although Ruth suspected she'd be seeing them soon. Universities were suspending their semesters due to rioting anti-augmentation groups and bomb threats from some synthetic sympathizers. The air smelled of fear and fatigue, frayed nerves and suspicion. It was chaos, as her uncle had predicted, and it was only the beginning. Beneath the still starry sky, glinting in oblivious beauty, Ruth stubbed her cigarette out on a gritty shingle. She didn't bother to brush away the ashes or discard the butt. She just ground it down and down and down, and then released it. Ruthie, startled. Ruthie sat up too quickly, nearly losing her footing. I apologize, my computer keeps trying to restart. Digging in with her heels and keeping her rear planted, she turned to see her uncle on the fire escape. Howard, hey. You all right? I'm fine, just, Ruth's eyes went guiltily to the cigarette butt. Thinking. Me too, said her uncle. What's on your mind? This morning? You, mostly. Ugh, boring. He gave her an unconvincing smile. Mind if I join you? She shook her head, and he eased himself down onto the rough rooftop, huffing a little as he made contact with the shingles. It occurred to Ruth that her uncle was old. He should be thinking about retirement, not revolution. He eyed her decimated cigarette. You're smoking again. Again. He thought she'd quit, which she never had. Yeah, sorry, she said, not really sorry, and certainly not sorry enough to attempt a complex lie. He sighed. I should give you a hard time about that. And that's all he said about her smoking, which made Ruth's jaw twitch. If he wasn't busting her on the cigarettes, there must be some truly serious shit going on. Ruth, there's something we need to discuss, he said haltingly, his words balanced as precariously as he was, an old man sitting on a rooftop as the world around him cracked and crumbled. You're special. Yeah, right, she said uncomfortably. Ruth didn't do well with compliments. At best, they felt unearned. She wasn't special. She was the opposite of special. She was nothing. Don't talk back to your old Uncle Dad. You're special, and it scares me. Because you, Ruth Fell, are a soldier. And I wish we lived in a world where I meant that as a metaphor for your moral convictions. But Ruthie, God, my little girl, that's not the world we're living in. And you're not a metaphorical warrior. You are an actual goddamn soldier. He paused, then prodded. Aren't you? I don't know what you mean, she whispered at last, lying. Were you part of the bombing last night? Her heart stopped. Her blood froze in her veins. She swallowed hard, a cold lump of dread barely making it down her throat. And then she nodded. Okay, he said, calm, not condemning. Thank you for answering honestly. Now that we're on the same page about that, we need to get on the same page about a few other things. Ruthie, at once thrilled and terrified, exhaled an icy breath. Okay. The night before, when she crept through the dark to the original site of the Synthetic Neuroscience Institute of Technology, a modest brick building near the MIT campus, Ruth knew she was taking her resistance involvement to the next level. She'd overheard some of the younger movement members talking in a small cluster on her family's porch after the larger meeting had ended. They were smoking and whispering about something they were working on, something explosive. At some point, she realized they were talking about an actual bomb. I want to help, she said. They looked at her dismissively. She was a teenager, growing out some bad bangs which hung heavy and awkward across her left eye. They were college dropouts who saw themselves as the legitimate resistance fighters. But they'd only been to a few of the meetings her uncle spearheaded. She'd been there since the beginning. You, me. You're too young, said one of the long-limbed boys, maybe 5 years older than Ruth. Really? She glared, hands curling and uncurling into fists, thighs stiffening as she dug in and held her ground. That's too bad. I guess I'll have to go ask my Uncle Howard what the age limit is for this assignment. Their expressions went from bemusement to narrow-eyed irritation. Ruth hated using that tattletale tactic, but she knew they wouldn't take her seriously otherwise. She was only 16 and a girl, which shouldn't matter, but did. And she didn't really know any of these guys. They had just shown up this week after their campus shut down. They didn't know her either, not enough to gamble on whether or not she really would rat them out. Fine, said the lean boy lightly. You can come, just stay the hell out of our way. Does anyone still work there? What? The lean guy snapped. The old Synth building. That's where you're attacking, right? Anyone work there? You shouldn't be asking questions, said a dirty blonde kid with severe acne. Seems like an important one, Ruth pressed. There's no one there, chimed in a third boy, a little older than the others, with a respectable afro and an unlit cigarette dangling from his lips. We did check. No one lives nearby either. This ain't about bloodshed, just making a statement. You still in? I'm in. Then shut up and come on. We got this. So she shut up, and they started walking. When they reached the long, low brick structure, it was full dark. But even in the moonlight, Ruth recognized the place and immediately felt uneasy. She didn't think it would seem so familiar, but it did. Sensory memories came rushing back, flooding through her. She remembered coming here with Howard to visit Nathan Fell, her father. This was his old office building, where he worked, where he spent all his time. This was the place that he had loved more than he loved her and Rachel. She did not tell any of this to the young men she was with. She didn't even know their names. She certainly wasn't going to lay bare her past scars. So she said nothing about her connection to the building. But she did volunteer to be the one to plant the explosive. The boys turned her down at first, but Ruth was insistent. Her smaller size meant she could slip through the chain link fence, which they probably couldn't. She was fast, too. She ran track, she told them. A lie, and thanks to the cigarettes, she wheezed at a slow jog. It just made sense, she insisted. Reluctantly, but also with some relief, the boys relented. Thanks to being built by a crack team of recent college dropouts, one of whom had been studying engineering, the boy with the afro, one of whom had watched far too many episodes of an old show called Mythbusters, the lean one, and one of whom was a budding sociopath, the one with acne. Their bomb was rigged with a remote detonator they hoped would work. All Ruth had to do was get it far enough into the building to center the blast, then get out and they could trigger it from afar. The plan was to plant it, sprint to the wooded clearing up a hill a little way from the building, close enough for the remote to work, far enough for shrapnel to miss them. They hoped. Ruth was handed the device. It didn't look like she thought a bomb would look. Not that she really knew what a bomb should look like. She'd only seen explosives in movies and cartoons, red sticks of dynamite with a fiery fuse or little boxes with LED countdowns taped under the seat of a bus. This thing was awkward, boxy, and patched together, wrapped in some wires. It was small, but heavy. You sure this will work? Positive, said Afro. It better, said Lean. It'll make a good mess at least, Zitz grinned into the dark. She shivered, then forced herself to still. After we do this one, if it works. It'll work, Afro said. Will you teach me how to make the next one? There was a pause. The boys stared. Zitz picked at his chin. Sure, said Lean, finally. You don't screw this up? Sure. Ruth nodded, started to walk away, then stopped, needing to confirm once more. You're sure there's no one in there? They were sure. The boys ran up the hill to the meeting point under the tree. Ruth strode carefully towards the building, holding the bomb gingerly in front of her. The boys had assured her that she wouldn't accidentally set it off unless maybe she fell and landed on it, but she didn't trust them, and she wasn't taking any chances. When she reached the chain link fence, she paused. She had used her small size to make the case that she could slip in most easily, but she wasn't seeing any breaks in the fence. Scaling the chain link might be an option if she were empty-handed, but she couldn't climb it with a bomb in hand, nor could she toss it over and follow it in. As she looked back and forth, the device still held out and away from her chest, she suddenly realized the gravity of the moment, what she was holding, what she was doing. The world intensified around and within her. She felt the weight of everything, the weight of the actual explosive clutched in her hands, the weight of its implications. Her senses heightened as she smelled the damp woodsy scent, mingling with the musty dust odor of the old brick building ahead. She heard the soft crunch of the boy's footsteps growing fainter and fainter behind her. Her eyes widened, adjusting like a cat, taking in all available light and letting her pupils expand to better see, yes, there, a gap. The chain link fence was relatively new, installed only after this building was shuttered, to keep out curious trespassers or young women with bombs. New meant no holes, but in this case, it also meant a quick installation with no supervision by fussy tenants. It was a slap-together, hasty bit of work by laborers who knew they were just putting up a deterrent around an empty building no one cared about anymore. Bathed in moonlight, as if someone above was helping shine the way for her, Ruth could clearly see a gap between the east-west side of the fence and the side running north-south. It was the corner nearest her, several inches wide. With a little grunt of thanks, running as quickly as she dared while carrying a bomb, Ruth bolted for the open corner. It was going to be tight, but she was pretty sure she could make it. She decided she'd get her body in first and pull the bomb through last. If she could hold the bomb in one hand, she could go as flat as possible. Right arm, then right leg, torso sideways, then her left leg, and then slowly, 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 she would pull in her left arm, hand clutching the device. Reaching the gap, Ruth didn't hesitate. She wrapped her left arm around the bomb, trembling a little as she pulled it close to her. It was hard against her soft chest, but at least it felt stable for now. She quickly slid her right arm through the gap. That was easy. Then her right leg, a little tighter, but not a problem. Pressing her back against the tall metal pole, she began navigating her torso through the small space and stopped. Stuck. Her head was wedged in the gap between the poles. Fearing her cranium might crack, convinced her nose was breaking, she forced her head through. Her heart pounded. She sucked in her breath, further flattening her smooth stomach, lifting her ribs, cursing her bones, her pesky widened hips, her whole stupid, too wide skeleton. She exhaled and painfully, finally, squeezed through the gap. As her body slipped through, she nearly dropped the package, but managed to press it with her hand against the fence, wrap her fingers around it, steady, steady, steady. Now she was in, all but her left arm clutching the explosive. All she had to do was get the bomb in. Her left fingers were gripping the device so tightly they were beginning to lose sensation. She pulled her left arm through the gap, up to her elbow, up to her wrist. Now she could reach back through with her right hand too. Gripping the device with both hands, she slowly began drawing it through the gap. It was too wide. Anyway, she turned it. She didn't want to try to force it through, get it stuck. A bomb caught in the periphery of the property was useless. She needed to get it in. She tried sliding it down, wondering if maybe she could dig a hole in the ground, widen the gap there. No, damn it. For some reason, the gap seemed to narrow the closer she got to the ground. She looked up. Yes, the pole was crooked, leaning. It got wider toward the top. Ruth's arms flew upward, clutching the bomb, lifting her arms as high as she could, praying that now the explosive device could make it through just a little higher. No, it was wider, but not wide enough. Not with what she could reach with her arms fully extended. She wished she were taller. She wished, no need for wishing. She could be taller. Tightening her stomach, focusing on balance, aiming for balance, chanting it like a mantra over and over. Balance, 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 balance. She looped her left foot through the chain link fence, then the right. The chain link pressed into her flesh as she leaned onto it. Balance, 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 and stepped higher, higher up onto another link. Exhaling, she lifted her arms, and the device slipped through the gap. The unexpected ease of its passage through the high portion of the fence surprised Ruth. The weight of it, held by fingertips above her head when she was balancing on chain link, tipped her backwards. Ruth fell straight back, landing hard on the ground, her stomach providing a cushion for the bomb still clutched in her hands. For a moment, she was still, ears ringing, head pounding, eyes closed. She lay for one long second in the dark, wondering if the bomb had gone off, wondering if this unnatural stillness was death. Then one of the boys from the hill whistled, checking on her, catching her attention. She opened her eyes. She was there, alive, through the fence, bomb intact. She slowly rose, pressing the bomb to her chest with one arm, no longer afraid of it going off, no longer afraid of anything. She raised her other arm to the boys, signaling she was all right. Then she headed for the building. The boys had said that putting it on the front step would be enough. No need to infiltrate the building. The front entrance placement would yield plenty of damage. But that wasn't good enough for Ruth. She walked up to the front door, already intent on finding a way in. The small pile of spare bricks stacked near the entrance felt like divine intervention. Carefully setting down the explosive, she picked up a brick and smashed the glass at the entryway. Reaching through the jagged glass, she unlocked the handle without so much as scratching herself. She opened the door, picked up the bomb, and walked inside, wishing she could see those boys' faces. Once inside, her vague memory swirled into something more solid. She walked with purpose through the reception area, past the central lab to the large office in the middle of the building. Her father's name was still displayed on the name placard by the door. Dr. Nathan Fell. Carefully, she set the bomb outside of his office door, below the placard, like a package delivery. Like a present just for him. Surprise, Daddy. Look what I made you. Then she turned and ran down the hallway, out the door, shoving herself roughly through the gap in the fence, banging her knee, wincing, limping up the hill to the boys. She was panting by the time she reached them, sweat pouring down her back, wild-eyed. Now, she said, now. One of them pushed a button, and there was the briefest of silences, then a deafening boom. They watched the night alight for only a moment, transfixed. Then a scream in the distance shattered their reverie. The young rebels scattered, running different paths back to their different homes and outposts, fleeing the scene. Ruth ran faster than any of them, ears ringing, heart singing, knee throbbing. She made it home. She was safe, whatever that meant. Ruth, Howard said, I'm proud of you. What you did took courage. I think you did it for the right reasons, but there are a few things you need to know. There was no one in the building. I know, Ruth said quickly. I asked, I made sure. We wouldn't have done it if... There was no one in the building, Howard continued, talking over her, no longer gentle. But after you left the scene, someone else came. They had bodies with them. Cadavers, hopefully from the morgue, but I don't know. They put the bodies in the building. I don't understand, Ruth said, gripped with a fear she could not comprehend. It's a setup, Ruthie. They want to discredit the movement, make us look violent, irrational, like we're savages, like we're the bad guys. When the news breaks, everyone will believe that we killed 3 people. But we didn't. We didn't. That's right. You didn't kill anyone, okay? I know that. You know that. No matter what the news reports or Felix Hess or anyone else says, the bodies are plants. We know the truth. But how would they know? Maybe one of those boys had other motives. Maybe we've been bugged. A sob caught in Ruth's throat as the reality of her situation closed in on her, suffocating her, cutting off her air. Even though her uncle had said that the bodies thrown into the building were already dead, the images of bodies smoldering in the inferno, an inferno she had caused, made her feel sick. You didn't kill anyone, sweet girl, Howard said, hugging her tight. His voice was like the sound of a heart breaking. But there were security cameras on the property. None of the boys were seen, but you were. She pulled back from the embrace, shaking. How can you know this already? Well, I'm afraid we might have a rat in our midst, but our enemies do too. So I trust this information. You being on camera, that'll mean a few things. First of all, we're going to have to lay pretty low. You're a minor, but this is going to be a hell of a charge, and we can't trust the system. I'm not letting anyone take you in. We're going underground. You mean leaving this house? Ruthie had lived in the Fell family home since she was a little girl. It was the house Sophie and Howard had dreamed of, 2 rambling stories in the center of Cambridge, white with green shutters, sprawling porch, shoddy old asphalt shingled roof. So familiar. And it had been home not only to her family, but to so many others. Students, activists, wandering artists who needed a hot meal. The Fell family home was an institution. Yes, we're leaving. Where will we go? For now, one of my friends has a house up outside Kennebunkport in his mother's name, pretty far off the grid, so Maine. Regroup and plan from there. Uncle Howard, I'm so sorry. A soldier doesn't apologize for doing the right thing. You hear me, Ruthie? Ruth was drowning, but in the midst of the whirlpool threatening to pull her under, she grasped the life preserver tossed her way, which buoyed and ultimately anchored her. A soldier. An acknowledgement. No, better. An assignment. She finally knew who she was, what she was meant to be. This was not another costume change, a role to play in lieu of discovering the real Ruth. A resistance fighter, a protector, a mission-driven mercenary, a soldier. Finding herself at last, Ruth Fell would live and die by this identity. Thank you. And if, Chris flag me, if not, if time allows, I will read just the very, very brief prologue opening to the newish Jewish folklore ghost story, 13 Jericho Lane. Great. Prologue. A ghost story might begin with death, deception, a buried secret, or it might begin with flowers. Daffodils, in this instance. Garish yellow, cheap and duck-like, crowded into a painted vase too decadent for such a peasant bouquet. Their cheer felt aggressive, a slap delivered with a smile. The courier who brought the blooms did not knock, nor did he linger. He set the ugly arrangement on the porch and left, his horseless carriage withdrawing with a motored snort. The petals fluttered and seemed to whisper, "May it happen when the hour is right." At this, the ghost awoke. The spirit did not know how long it had been in the void. It was unable to pin down any of the skittering recollections flitting and fleeing its blurred mind like cockroaches. The violently pleasant daffodils were not helping. They were a harsh torch in a dark place, unnatural, unnecessary, unfamiliar. Despite recalling little, the ghost knew no one had ever brought them flowers. No one ever would. When the hour is right, the flowers teased, petals fluttering. The spirit glared at the petals, too full of promise, too new, too alive. Such an affront could not go unpunished. As soon as the sun slipped behind a cloud, the ghost reached out, expanding, unfurling. This hour is mine, the ghost proclaimed. At this silent assertion, all the waiting shadows gathered around the flowers, merciless, cold, closing in. Within moments of being placed on the ominous porch of 13 Jericho Lane, the rootless blooms began to wilt.
Okay, thank you so much, Beth. I'll open the floor for any questions or comments for our last author.
Beth, I really enjoyed Original Sin, and I'm looking forward to reading the other 2 volumes. When I was reading it, though, I wondered what were your own influences on developing that story, and did you draw them from any kind of classic science fiction books or films?
Thank you. Yes, great question. I was raised by a hardcore sci-fi nerd, my mother. So we always had a subscription to science fiction and fantasy magazine, and a lot of Isaac Asimov coming through our house as a child. And I read everything in that genre that I could get my hands on as a kid. I was especially fond of Ender's Game, and then later had a more complicated relationship with that series. But yeah, I think that that's a big influence, was how do we connect these now very tangible and real world potentials, because I think that's the difference for authors writing now as opposed to 50 or 60 years ago. How do we keep up and incorporate those influences, but also do more research into what is actually coming up? Because I can say some of the things that are casually mentioned in Original Sin are technology now. So it's sort of a balance of looking at the future past, if that makes sense, of this rich genre, but also doing a lot of real world reading about our future and how much is in the works around all of that.
Thank you very much. I appreciate it.
Thank you for the question.
I have a question, Beth. I'm really interested that you started writing this series in your 20s, and it's focused on this 16-year-old girl character who is kind of coming into her own. I imagine that it must have been very cathartic for you as a young woman to kind of look back onto some version of your younger self and maybe give her a little bit more power. So this is kind of a general question, but how do you feel when you're writing, in the writing process?
Oh, what a great question. I would now love to hear every writer's answer to that, but I will give mine. I feel increasingly powerful and scared when I write. I think there's a lot of responsibility that comes, especially when we are trying to tell stories that are close to the bone for us, and also when we're trying to incorporate characters that don't all look and sound like us. You want to get it right. You want to honor every character that you create. So that contributes to the anxiety and fear, but particularly because in the writing moment, before you're turning it over to beta readers or having anyone else consider the words, you get to crank something out and then go back and fix it. And there's something powerful in knowing that the control is entirely yours for the first part of the writing process. And you do have to give up a little bit of that control moving forward, which can be when you feel like you lose a little bit of your power as a writer. Katy, I don't know if that's also true for you when you're handing it over to editors and agents and going on sub and going, well, this is when the baby starts getting raised by someone else. But those first few weeks or months or maybe years that you spend with a text getting to figure out what it's supposed to be, you're in that creator role that does feel really empowering. And I think that for a lot of us, that is a feeling that's lacking in other areas of our lives for various reasons, and especially in this moment. And so being able to pull back some of that power and sit there and create a world is a really lovely gift. Thanks for that question and for your reading, which was lovely to hear in your voice.
Any other comments or questions?
I was wondering, how do you approach it differently when you sit down to write a play versus a work of fiction?
Great question. I'm a big believer that every story has the home that is best for it. I think it's the reason that so many people will say, oh, the book is so much better after you see a movie of an adaptation of a beloved work, because some things are cinematic and some things lend themselves to prose. For me, I see the story very differently and know pretty early on if it's going to be a novel or a play. As someone who's been a theater person my whole life, what I love most about playwriting is that it is the most beautiful, unfinished work of writing that you have the privilege to produce, because you are always going to have to leave room for directors, for designers, for actors. And so you don't write out absolutely everything. You don't build the entire world. And so when I start seeing a story that is more about characters and conversations, but has room for them to move in a space and doesn't require a whole lot of territory, literally, I know that I'm probably moving more in the direction of a play. Whereas when I know that I need to build out an entire world and I want to make sure that every detail is something that I don't relinquish much control over, I know that I'm probably going to be heading towards a novel, because that's in your hands. Whereas the collaborative art of playwriting means you want to be bringing in other artists and trusting that if you say they're in a goth steampunk world, a designer will figure out each time exactly what that means. You don't have to describe every single corner of what that goth steampunk world looks like. I will say my thesis when I was at the W finishing up the MFA program was to adapt one of my earliest full-length plays into a novel and to write a reflective paper about what that process was like and what aspects of the story lent themselves better in each genre. So it was really interesting for me to get to reflect and sort of dissect through that very process. And I think it distilled for me even more and sharpened my own sense very early on of, yep, this is a play. Nope, this is a novel. Thank you.
Hi, Beth. I was wondering if you could talk just a little bit more about how important it is to write a strong female protagonist, and this one in particular, Ruth.
Yeah, thank you, Jeanne, for that question. I think that's something that's become increasingly important to me, because when it was pointed out to me, especially for those of you who have read Original Sin and in the first book, most people would point to Eyre as, the primary protagonist and Dr. Felix Hess as the antagonist, and they're both guys. And the fact that I didn't even notice that when I was writing the book in my 20s, because I was so acculturated in the books that I was reading, based on the authors who were writing them, that just seemed like, oh, that's how you get into that world. I immediately began second guessing myself. And every project moving forward, I asked, does this have to be a male character? And the answer is almost always no. Nothing against men, but I think that there is so much room to write these strong female characters. And I think there's so much that is interesting. There's the ghost story that I have out on submission now, and the Golem story that I'm currently working on, both take some really ancient Jewish folklore notions where there are literally no female characters in any of the source texts that you pull out about them, and how much it cracks open about these stories if you make it instead a female golem. If you have women who are exploring how you get rid of or solve the mystery of a ghost, it changes the story from the very beginning. But yeah, I think it's important both so that our young readers see themselves in books more, and I believe that that is important across the spectrum, not just for strong female characters, but that there are more protagonists of color, that there are more queer protagonists, that there's more representation throughout literature, so that someone who is in the writing world in their 20s does not suddenly find themselves surprised that they're perpetuating this practice of having stories that lead with men or stories that lead with white people. And so, yeah, now my habit, finally, a decade later, is to not start with a man, to not start with the more traditional protagonists. And it's something that I look for in everything else that I'm reading, and that I hope that I get to encourage other people to question and think about a little bit more. So thank you for the lovely question.
Beth, we have a question from your comrade in arms from the first graduating group of MFA students in our program, Tammy Ward-Rice.
Hey, Tammy.
On Facebook. Says, dystopian fiction presents the struggle between the promise and the inevitable usurpation of new technology for power and profit. Do you think that a story where this does not happen could be interesting enough to be successful?
No, we always have to have horrible things happen. If we don't have the conflict, then where's the story? But yeah, I think that, and you know, joking intro aside about the fact that we are living in some level of dystopia now, I think that the whole point of the dystopian genre is to force us to think, what's the worst that could happen? What could we do with this technology that could lead us off the rails? And I sort of play in the titles, at least, with a little bit of the religious undertone, I would say, rather than overtone, of original sin, born in sin, sin and salvation, because I think that it's one of those fundamental questions of how far can you go in playing God, with the technology aspect being what we layer over that before things really go awry. So yeah, thanks, Tammy.
Beth, I had a question for you. Thanks for being here. I'm a first semester student in the MFA program. And
Awesome.
so I was wondering if you could speak to your success in the program and how you could, if you had any advice for us, how to get through it. And then afterward, how you transitioned out of the program and into writing and being involved as much as you are.
Yeah, congrats on being in the program, Missy, and I look forward to what will come from you. Lean into your cohort is one of the biggest suggestions that I can give. I still have folks that I went to the W with who I will send an early draft of what I'm working on and ask for feedback, because it is sort of stark after you have this immersive experience to no longer have a built-in community of writers that are going to help you with all of that. So make that a habit and make a plan to keep that as a habit once you've finished the program. And also the faculty are so committed to the students. I mean, that's what really stood out to me about the program. Don't be afraid while you're in the program to express what it is you're hoping for next and what you want to do, and ask them to help you in that and to hold you accountable and to keep you in the community. I feel really honored to be here, and I feel like in part it's because Kendall and Chris and Mary Miller and the faculty I was able to connect with while in the program have also become friends and colleagues that I don't hesitate to email if I have a question or want to try to connect over something that's upcoming. As far as the transition out, I will say, first of all, there's a great article that was in American Theater magazine a couple months ago, Playwrights Don't Quit Your Day Jobs. And it's sort of honoring the fact that especially right now, there should be no shame as you're establishing your writing career in needing to continue full or part-time work. So don't feel like you finish this program and then you're a full-time writer, full stop, that's what happens. It takes time. It was almost 2 years after I finished the program before I signed with a really good literary agent. That was a whole other process, and we can talk offline about that some other time. But it takes a while to get a foothold. It's a very saturated market. It's very tough to take that next step, but it is very much about continuing to do the work, to continuing to connect with other writers, and to be gentle with yourself and not expect that, all right, I have an MFA in hand, so now I'm a writer and that's what's going to pay my bills. You don't get an MFA in hand so that writing will pay your bills. You get it to buy yourself the time to invest in your writing and tell yourself that you care enough about being a writer to go through this academic experience and to connect with your colleagues in the classroom, your peers and your faculty, so that you are fortified and have those tools for the slog that publishing is to keep going as you take that next step. And I hope that wasn't too long-winded an answer, but there you go.
Thank you.
Thank you.
All right, I think we have time for one more, if there is another question or comment. Okay, well, I expect your essays by 5 o'clock this afternoon. So now I guess that's it from my part. I will turn it back over to Dr. Dunkelberg. So thank you.
Thank you, Chris, and thank you, everyone, both our riders this morning, our audience, obviously, everyone who's been here all weekend long. We could keep talking all afternoon and for a long, long time beyond that. But there always comes a time for the curtain to come down. And I'll just end it with the reminder that we hope to be back. We will be back in some shape or form next year, starting October 21st. That's the Thursday through the 23rd. We'll see what 2021 brings us and where we are and how we do it, but we'll make it happen. And we've really enjoyed being able to bring in people on Facebook and through Zoom who maybe otherwise couldn't be physically present on campus, especially this year. But in any year, we often have people who'd love to come to the symposium. So I know one thing that we'll be looking into throughout the year is how can we hopefully combine a live event and live streaming. I think that should be possible and something we'd like to do for our MFA students, alums, and other people around the country who'd like to be at the symposium and maybe can't make the trip to Columbus. So we want desperately to have lots of people in an auditorium and that personal face-to-face handshaking, etc., that often goes on. One thing I would like to do is to encourage you all to give us your feedback. Normally we would have a paper program and we would hand you a piece of paper and it would say, write your comments on here and check off what you think of each panel. We've always had, or for a number of years, we've had an online option to do it through a Google form. And usually there's like 2 or 3 people who do the Google form and the others use their pens, which is fine. I love that, but we don't have the paper form this time. So I have a link in our Welty Symposium Facebook group, and I'll send it out to people to the Google form. And if you would, we would greatly appreciate both your checking off on which panels you went to and that kind of thing and how you felt about them, and also certainly your comments about how this has gone. It's been a great experiment. I think it's gone relatively well myself, but let us know what your suggestions are, etc. So once again, thank you all so very much for being here. It's been great. Anyone in Zoom who wants to hang out for just a little while and continue the conversation, y'all are welcome to do that. I'll stick around and we'll sign off on Facebook. Have a great weekend. See you next year.